Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Lambda School mini bootcamp. My name is Dan Frainer, and this is going to be lesson 4, the kind of our introduction to JavaScript. So the last few days, we've been working on HTML and CSS. On our first day, we got set up with Git and GitHub, and then yesterday and the day before, we were working with HTML and CSS, and that's all stuff you can kind of see on the web page. And today we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to start talking about JavaScript, the computer language itself. And so let me get down to it. The things we're going to talk about today, I'll give you a quick introduction to JavaScript and what it is. We're going to talk about variables in JavaScript. We're going to talk about our primitive data types, which are strings, numbers, and Booleans. We'll talk about the math in JavaScript and the global object math. Then we're going to get an introduction to functions, and then start to talk about control flow and comparison operators a little bit. We're going to end tonight's lesson with an introduction to Nodejs and Npm. And we only get into that because that's how our tests are run. So when you do your assignments, you'll run a test, and it'll tell you how many of the questions you got right or wrong, and you keep doing that until you pass all the tests. So that's what's on our agenda for tonight. So let's get right down to it. Tonight we're going to talk about JavaScript, and JavaScript is a pretty integral part of the web these days. I like to give the analogy, we imagine that we're building a house, and the HTML is like all the bricks and concrete and wood kind of just sitting in a pile for us. The CSS is how we put all that HTML together, how we build a house out of it, and how we make it look nice and paint it and get everything looking really great. JavaScript comes in, and we can imagine that JavaScript as being kind of the electricity and the plumbing and the gas of the house. It's really what makes the house run. It's kind of behind the scenes, and you need something to power your refrigerator and power your stove, and that's what the JavaScript is in this house analogy. So HTML, CSS, and then the JavaScript kind of runs everything. So JavaScript has been around for a while, since I believe 1994. And in the beginning, it was created just as a way for front-end web developers to add some functionality to their website. So anytime you click a button or you drag and drop something on a website, that's JavaScript working right there. And that's what it was originally intended for. And it worked really well for a long time in that aspect. Gave some functionality to the website you were looking at, and that's about all it did. Recently, Google introduced something called the V8 engine. The V8 engine is one of a couple of new engines, JavaScript engines, that really sped JavaScript up quite a bit. There was kind of this resurgence in JavaScript, and it improved the speed and the functionality of the language as a whole. And that led to the development of some really exciting new front-end frameworks, and eventually led to the development of Nodejs, which is a way to run JavaScript as a language on a server, and we consider that back-end. This development led to this huge resurgence in JavaScript, the Node and the new frameworks, and now JavaScript is one of the most widely used programming languages, and we find JavaScript in anywhere we would find a traditional programming language. On the front end, back end, we develop mobile apps with it, IoT, games. There's just anything you can imagine where a traditional programming language would be used. Recently, every couple of years, there comes new language specs. And the newest one, the latest major kind of introduction to JavaScript is called ES6 or ES 2015. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in this course, and in the mini bootcamp, and then also in the full course as well, if you choose to join us for the full course. A couple things to keep in mind. JavaScript is not Java. They're two very, very different programming languages, and they kind of get lumped in, talked about together just because they share a really similar name. That was a feature of the early JavaScript pioneers. Unfortunately, they wanted it to sound similar to a widely recognized programming languages, but that's about where the similarities end. So when you're talking about JavaScript, talk about JavaScript and it's not Java. They're not interchangeable at all. They're two very different programming languages. So let me share my screen and we can get going. There we go. So today we're going to switch up. We're not using CodePen any longer. I'm not going to be using CodePen. I'm going to be using another program very similar, but it's really focused on just writing a programming language. And in this case, we're writing JavaScript in here, and it's a web app called Replit. So once again, I'm using this web app just to show you there's instant readout from it, just like our CodePen the last couple of days, how we saw an HTML page over here. On the right here is just going to be a console for us to get an instant readout of. So we can write code over here, press run, and it'll run the program, and we'll get a readout over here. This is not where you are to be doing your assignments. You please complete your assignments in your text editor of choice, VS Code, Sublime, Atom, Emacs, Vim, whatever you choose. Please complete your assignments in that, and I'll show you a little bit later how to run the tests. We can't run any of those tests in this sandbox development environment here. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to show you how things work in here, but then please go and run it in your text editor of choice. So the first thing we're going to talk about when we talk about JavaScript is we're going to talk about variables. So variables are kind of the heart of JavaScript. It's a way to store the value of something and give it a name and be able to use it later. If you are coming from another programming language or you've done a little bit of work, just note that JavaScript is not strictly typed language, and so you don't have to declare the type when you set the variable. You can set a variable and set it to any type you'd like. Just keep that in mind. If you haven't come across if you haven't worked with any of the programming languages, forget I said anything about that. But right now we're just going to focus on creating a variable. So the anatomy of a variable is first the keyword we're going to use. There's 3 different keywords we're going to use, and I'll kind of go through all 3 of them as we go. The first is var. So var just stands for variable. So you're going to type var, give it a space, and then you're going to give it a name. I'm going to give this variable the name of name. Okay, so now we've given the variable a name. We've told the JavaScript transpiler that we're using a variable. We've given it the name of name, and we give it an equal sign. Anytime we see a single equal sign in JavaScript, we know that that is an assignment. We know that we are going to assign something to this name. So keep that in mind. We're going to use a couple of different versions of equal signs as we go. But when you see a single equal sign, just get it in your mind right now that that's an assignment. And I'll just give it my name. So we give it the keyword to tell the transpiler that we're going to give it a variable. We give it the name of the variable, which I've just given it name, an equal sign, and what we're going to assign it to. In this case, I've assigned it to a string, and a string is just any block of text. And we'll go over that in just a moment. But this is a string. The second way we can do it, and this is an ES6 way of doing it, is using the keyword of let. We'll go first name on that. So we say let, and then we give it the name. We'll say last name, and I'll give it my last name. One last other thing to point out is you see we've used a semicolon here at the end. This just tells the computer that we're done telling it what the variable is. This says, all right, stop doing what you're doing and now go to the next line of code. So that's what the semicolon is. It is required in this course just because JavaScript tries to be this very friendly language. And if you don't put a semicolon in, it'll still run, but it'll try to figure out what you meant by that. In most cases, it'll run fine without any issues, but there are cases where a missing semicolon can make your program crash. So we always want to include the semicolon until you get enough familiarity with the language itself and knowing exactly where those edge cases happen. Just always include the semicolon in there. So the third way of declaring a variable is the keyword const. And const has kind of its own behavior to it. Const is going to be a variable that cannot be changed. So if I give it favorite number, favorite number is going to be set one time, and we're never going to be able to set favorite number to anything else again. And so, so if I tried to somewhere along the line equals 100, you'll see we'll get a little error here, cannot override, which is a constant. We use constants when we know we're not going to change the variable. It just helps us maintain the integrity of that variable. And we use constants. Constants come in big handy when you're building a really big program and you need to save things like keys and passwords, and you never want to have anyone change those. You would use constant. For the majority of this class, as long as we're not changing, we don't have any plans to change the variable, we're going to use const. And you'll probably not see us use var at all in this class. Var and let are very similar. There are a couple of differences with them that you'll learn down the line, but just know that they're pretty much interchangeable except for a few minor differences. So that's how we declare a variable. One last thing I'm going to introduce you to right now is something called console log. And I'll go over what this is exactly at a little later time. But right now, just know that if we type console dot and log and give it 2 parentheses, we can make it read whatever we want to the screen. So let's say, here I am. And I click run, and you'll see that here I am is printed to the screen. So it's just essentially printing what you asked it to the console. We can also include variables in here. So we can say first name, and it'll print the first name, whatever that variable equals. And that's kind of getting us started on how we're going to use variables. We see that we have first name that equals of something, and now we can use first name, and it's always going to read out Dan no matter what until we change it to something in the future. So let's get talking about our primitive data types. The 3 most basic data types in JavaScript are, number 1, strings. And this is a string here. And a string is any block of text surrounded by quotes. They can be double quotes, they can be single quotes, and they can be backticks. And backticks have a specific purpose. We are going to be using single quotes for this class, just as a style reference. And it also helps us use double quotes inside of our quotes there. So any text within those quotes is considered a string. Anytime you see quotes, you'll know that that is a string. And this can be numbers in here, it can be symbols, it can be any text whatsoever, and this is always going to be a string as long as it's in quotes. We see we have another string right here. Coming to the third line here, we'll see we have a number. Let me actually do this. String. This is a number. And there is no differentiation differentiating between number types in JavaScript. So once again, if you're from another language, there's no floats or ints or big ints or anything. They're all numbers. So a number can be a whole number. It can be a float. It can be a negative number, and they're all numbers. So just know that when you see a number on the screen and it's not wrapped in quotes, it's a number type. The third type we'll talk about is a Boolean. And Boolean. Booleans are in JavaScript, they're pretty basic concept to understand. But in computer science as a whole, they really come from low-level computer science concepts. It's the same concept that powers binary code and the very core of our computers. You know, if you've ever seen binary before, you know, it's just a bunch of ones and zeros. That's essentially, each one of those is a Boolean. It's either a 1 or a 0. It's either an on or an off when it comes to computer switches. And in JavaScript, it's either true or false. And so to write a Boolean, we just write true or we just write false. And notice that we're not putting quotes around the true and the false because that would make it a string. If there's a true or a false with no quotes, we know that that's a Boolean. And it seems pretty simple right now, but things are going to get a little complicated with Booleans as we go. So just keep in mind that Boolean is essentially going to be one of two things, either a true or a false. So let's move on to math in JavaScript. Math in JavaScript works the same way that math would on your calculator, essentially. We can just write 1 plus 1, and we'll get it to read out, 2. And we can just write it just like we would on a calculator. 1 minus 1, 0. Let's say 2. And then we have the multiplication symbol, which is the asterisk. 2 times 10. We'll see it's 20. And then 10 divided by 2. And the divided by symbol is just that little forward slash, the divided by a refraction symbol. It's going to say divided by 10 divided by 2, and we'll get 5. So those are all pretty basic. We know most of those already. Multiplication, addition, subtraction, division, it's all pretty basic to us. Then a new math operator we're going to talk about, thank you, is called a modulus. So a modulus is a percent symbol. And a percent symbol is a modulus. And what the modulus does, or the modulo, is that it divides the first number by the second number. And it doesn't return how much it divides by. That's what our division symbol is for. What it returns is the remainder. So if I did 10 modulus 2 here, let's think about it. What's 10 divided by 2? 10 divided by 2 equals 5. Okay. And it equals 5 as a whole number. It equally divides 10 by 5. What if I did 10 modulus 3? So that would be 10 divided by 3 equals 3 with a remainder of 1. And so what the modulus is going to do is it's going to return that remainder. We can see it returns 1. And we can do that with 101 modulus 65. And it'll be 36. Just to make that a little more clear, we can do 5 modulus 2. What's 5 divided by 2? It's 2 with a remainder of 1. And we have 1. Same thing, we'll always have a remainder of 1 with 2, but let's go with 4. 15 divided by 4 is 12. So it would actually be 3 with the remainder of 2, or 3. So then we get the remainder of 3. right? So that's how a modulus works. It always returns the remainder. It never returns the amount of times it divides into it. Okay, it always returns the remainder. And right now you're probably thinking, why would I ever care about the remainder? And there are practical applications, and you'll use it a lot more than you think you will, especially even getting right into our assignments here. Let's talk about global objects. 1 second. JavaScript gives us a lot of functions and objects for free. Right out the bat, we've already used one so far, and that's called the console object. It gives us the console as a built-in object for us, and it has a method called log. And we can then print what we want to the screen. It logs it to our console. So that's one built-in global objects JavaScript gives us. And as you journey through JavaScript and you learn all of the things about JavaScript, you'll start to work with a lot of different built-in objects. We'll talk about our second one tonight, which is just called math. And math is written just as this. No quotes around it. Remember, if you put quotes around it, that means it's string. And it has an uppercase M. That is very important. A lowercase math is nothing. Math is not defined. An uppercase math is something. It's an object. And so math has methods on it as well. And we're going to go over a couple of those methods tonight. The first one we're going to talk about is pow. Math.pow, and it takes two numbers. So what this is going to do is this is going to raise a number to an exponent. So, if we had 2 and then imagine a little 2 up next to it, that would be math, or 2 squared. We can give it 2, 2, and then it's the first number would be the big number in the exponent, and the second number is the little number up above next to it, and we'll see it's 4. And we can do any numbers we want. We want 9 squared is 81. And there we go. We can also raise it to whatever power we want. So 3, and we should get 8, 4, and we can do whatever power we want up next to it. So that's math.pow, and that returns the number raised to an exponent. The next one we're going to talk about is math.floor. We are able to round. Let's talk about round first, actually. So round is going to round out the number exactly the way you would think it's going to do, in your elementary math classes. So you have a number, and it's 2.78. So round is going to use our 0.5 and above, and it's going to round it up. Below 0.5, it's going to round it down. So anything below 0.5 is going to round it down to the nearest whole number, and anything 0.5 and up, it's going to round up to the nearest whole number. So this should be 3. And then just 2.48 is lower than 0.5, so we'll round down to 2. So round works just the way you think a round would in your early elementary math classes. What if we want to choose which direction it rounds in? We want to always round down, or we want to always round up. Well, we can use, there are 2 different methods. First is floor, and floor is always going to round down. 2.48, we would expect it to round down to 2. 2.98, and if we were using round, that would definitely round up to 3, but with floor, it rounds down to 2. Okay, and this can be close to 3 as we can, and it'll always round down. So the next item is seal. It means the ceiling. It probably would have been more intuitive if they had named it roof or something like that. But it's floor and ceil, C-E-I-L. And that's always going to round up. We can see it rounds up to 3. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And even if it was 2.001, if it's math.ceil, it's always going to round up to 3. And we'll just make something else so you can see. There it is, 10.001 rounded up to 11. So that's round, floor, and ceil. And then also POW. So POW is going to use our exponents for us. A couple of built-in methods that I'd like to show you guys right now. While we're on the built-in methods, there's one in particular that I think is really important, and that's the length method on strings. So once again, my first name is Dan, and then we can say first name dot length. And what dot length is going to do is it's going to look at the string that first name is equal to, and it's going to ask how many characters are in that string. There's going to be 3 characters in that string. If I put my as just name and give it my full name, it's going to count every single character in this string. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, and it does count spaces because that's a character in the string. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 characters. And we'll see that we get the 11 back there. So it tells us how many characters total are in our string. Okay. That's the dot length method. That's on strings, and that's also on another data type that we'll talk about on Monday. So now that we have all of these variables and data types, and we know how to create strings and Booleans and numbers and math functions and things like that, we now need to set up something in JavaScript that will run a program essentially for us. We need something to compute the numbers and change the strings and add things together and do stuff for us. And what that is called it's called a function. And so functions in JavaScript are written one of 3 ways. The way we're going to use in this class is we just write function. We write function just like we wrote const or var or let. It's a keyword that tells the computer that we are going to give it a function. And we give the function a name. So we can just call it my function. We give it a name. And this is kind of where it differentiates between a variable. Right after the name, we give it an open and close parentheses. And right after the open and close parentheses, we're going to give it a space and an open and close curly brace. And so we'll go over what each of these does, but this is our basic function syntax. A couple other ways to write a function that we're not going to use in this class, but I just want to show to you, would be to const my equal. So we're creating a variable and equaling it to a function without a name, essentially. And the third way is the ES6 way, and that's saying const function, giving it a name, and then not giving it the function, just giving it the parentheses, and we call this fat arrow. And it has special properties that we will talk about in the full course, but in this mini boot camp, we're just going to be focused on using the actual function keyword, the name of the function itself, parentheses, and the braces. So within our braces, that's where all the code's going to go. That's where everything that we're going to want to happen is going to happen. So let's say we just wanted to console log my name real quick. Pretty simple. So now we have a function here that when it's run, will console log my name. To run a function, we are always going to write the name of the function, and we're going to put those parentheses on the end. And those parentheses tell the computer, go look up this function. Okay, you found it. Now run that function. If you don't put these parentheses on the end, nothing's going to happen. That's like putting your key in the ignition right here and turning it on is what those parentheses are. So imagine them as being the key for your ignition, and you have to turn that function on before it does anything. But once you turn it on, it's going to go. Okay, so now we can, functions don't need, because functions have an open and closing brace, they don't need semicolons because the computer already knows where it ends. So now we see we've gotten in the car, put the key in the ignition by putting those parentheses there, and it turned it on and it ran it. And now it's console log Dan. Okay, and that's how a function works. And we can write the code we want in here. So we can go const first num equals 10, const second num equals 20, and then we can console log first num plus second. We'll see that it prints it out exactly what we wanted, 10 plus 20, and we can write all the code we want inside of these braces, and it'll go through and run this code only when you put those parentheses on the end. Okay, so that's very important. The third thing we're going to talk about with functions are called arguments. And arguments are things that you'll put into a function, and then it gives it access to. So essentially, they're just variables that we preset. So let's go first name and last name. Okay. So now we have my function. We've given it a couple of variable names, and those aren't set to anything until we put them in when we run the function. We're going to just say first name plus last name. This is a new feature that we're introducing you to right now. And this just adds two strings together and creates one string. So we're going to want a space in between those names as well. So now this is going to add the first name, a space, and the last name. It's going to make one string out of all of that. So now we have a reusable function that will just print the first name and last name out of there. So now we can give it my first name, my last name. And the great thing about this now is that we are able to reuse this function, that I don't have Dan Frainer put in there and hard-coded in there. I can use this function for anyone's name. I can use it, my function, George Washington. Now you see it prints my name and it prints George Washington's name, and you can use this over and over and over and over again. And it kind of introduces a concept in software engineering that we like to call dry code, and that's do not repeat yourself. So if you find that you're console logging someone or many people's first names and last names, you should write a function. And then you can do it whenever you want, and you don't have to repeat the code at all. A couple things to note, excuse me, is that the arguments are separated by a comma. If you don't have that comma, you're going to see it's going to throw an error. So you have to separate your arguments by comma, and then they will also be separated by comma when you call the function. The order in which you put the arguments in when you call it directly correlate to the order that you see inside of the function. So first name will always equal the first item that's given to it. Last name will always equal the second item that's given to it in this function here. Just know that they correlate one-to-one with the arguments, okay? So those are arguments in functions. A quick introduction to return statement and scope. So console log is fine and dandy for developers. We use console log as developers in order to see what's going on within our code. Console log is not very handy for actually writing programs. It doesn't do anything. It just logs what you want to the screen, to your console, and that's it. If we want to get something out of the function, we need to use something called return. So what this is going to do is let's do this. Let's create a new string. New string equals, and we'll use this first name and last name. And we'll actually put, this is a hello string. Name and last name plus space says hello. Okay, and now we can return hello string. So let's use George Washington here, and let's run this function. Now we see George Washington says hello. But let's console log hello string outside of that function. We're going to get an error. Hello string is not defined. Well, how is it not defined? We defined it right here. This is your introduction to function scope. So any variables or anything declared inside of these braces is only available inside of those braces. Okay, if we can do all the code we want and nothing is available outside of those braces. We must return whatever we've done in there in order to get access to it. And even then, we don't have access to hello string. We have access to what hello string equals. Okay, so now we can const George Washington string equals that, and now we can console log BW string. So this is going to return the hello string, and now we can set a variable to what this function returns. Now we can see George Washington says hello. So that's really important to know that if you create variables within the function itself, they are not accessible outside of the function. Okay, that is called function scope. However, anything outside of the function is available within it. So if we had another variable out here, I could reach out and grab it. But just for the time being, just know that if you create something inside of those braces, you cannot access it outside of them unless you return it. A couple of things about a return statement. Let's do this. Return statements are going to be run the minute the function sees them. It's going to stop doing what it does. So let's do that. Return hello string, const goodbye string. And we can say as goodbye. Okay, so what's going to happen when I run this function is that it's going to create a new variable called hello string. It is, going to create a string out of it. It's going to hit this return right here, and it's going to return hello string. And then it's going to stop running. return is essentially turning the key off from the function. As soon as it sees return, as soon as it reaches that line, it instantly gives you what you've asked for it to return, and it turns the key off, and it doesn't get to run the rest of that ever. And we can see it says hello, but it returned goodbye string as well. Why didn't it do that? And we'll see even now, the replit is giving us an error. Where after return, oh, it's missing a semicolon. Thanks, replit. So just know that when a function sees a return, it returns exactly what you asked it to, and then it stops running. It's very important. So you can't have multiple returns as long as the function can see them all. And we'll start talking in a little bit about right now how to make multiple returns. So let's do this. Let's add another argument and go goodbye. And so goodbye is going to be a Boolean. Oops. And we're going to say true. So we have access, and let me kind of make this a little bit bigger. We have access to something called control flow. And we're going to start talking about control flow today, and we're going to continue with it on Monday. The control flow is saying, do something if the circumstances that you're currently in warrant it, do it. If not, do something else. And we use that using an if statement. So it's just if and parentheses and then braces. So it looks just like a function, but it has its own characteristics. And now we can say if, and when what's in these parentheses is going to be a statement that is always going to return a Boolean. If statements always look for Booleans. So we're going to say goodbye. If goodbye. All right. So goodbye is just let's do it that way. If goodbye, then let's do something. Okay, so if we have that it says goodbye up here, we see that we've set it to true here. So now goodbye is going to equal true. So if statements are always looking for a Boolean, a true or a false. So if that's true, then create that string and return that string. Otherwise, go and return this. Oops, goodbye. Now we see George Washington says goodbye. Because the if statement said it, we reach our first return and it stops running. If this was false, we'd say George Washington says hello, because it says if, and this is false. If it gets a false here, it does not look at any of that code. Okay, if this is false, it doesn't look at any of the code between those braces. So keep that in mind. Okay. This is our introduction to what we would call control flow. And we're going to talk about control flow and more comparison operators tomorrow. And yeah, we can talk about comparison operators right now. So comparison operators are going to be your greater than or equal, less than or equal. And we have what we know as a triple equals. It's just 3 equal signs. So this is going to compare items, right? So now we can say if goodbye equals true, then do this. So this is going to, the comparison operators are always going to return a Boolean, true or false. Let me get rid of that for a moment. And I'll get rid of that. So we can say 1 is greater than 0. and it returns true. 1 is greater than 2, and it returns false. And that works the same way for all of our comparison operators. Okay, less than or equals to, and we have triple equals. And triple equals is going to compare the two and ask if they are equal. Not only that, it's going to compare if they are equal the same type. So if they're both numbers. If I had 1 was a 1 as a number and 1 was a 1 as a string, it's going to return false. And so just keep that in mind. So triple equals is what we're always going to use. There is a double equals. We're not going to go into it just yet today, and we're not going to use it at all in this course. We're always going to use triple equals. And so that is control flow and comparison operators. And we will get into else statements. We will get into if-else statements. We'll get into more comparison operators on Monday. This is just an introduction to it here because there are exercises on the homework tonight that are going to use this. Before we leave and before I open it up for questions, I want to introduce you guys to something called Nodejs. In your GitHub repo, in the README file for today's lesson, there is a link, and I'll actually just pull that on right here. There at the very bottom of this README file, you'll find the introduction to JavaScript. You'll go to the very bottom, and there is a link down here to download and install Nodejs. And this works for any computer. Linux, you're going to have to do a little bit more, but Windows and Mac just have their installers right here. You just click on that, it's going to download it, you install it, and now you're going to have Nodejs available on your computer. So once you have downloaded and installed that, it's also going to install something called Npm, which is a package manager for JavaScript and for Node. And that is what we're going to use to run our tests. So let me open up terminal. Oh, I'll use iterms. So you open up your terminal. Let's find your way to pre-course. Let's go cd pre-course ls. And we're going to go npm. Once you have it installed, first of all, do npm version and make sure that a version number comes up. Otherwise, you don't have Node installed. And remember, on Windows, this is going to be in your git bash terminal. On Mac, it's in your terminal. On Linux, is in your terminal. Then we're going to go npm install. Okay, and click enter. And that's going to install all the packages we need to run the tests. And it's going to take a minute. And there it goes. It'll say it's created a lock file. You should commit this file. Don't worry about any of that. That's just a generic. It creates this package lock file on your in your course here. But now we have the ability to test our files. So let's open up. Oops. Let's go file open. We'll open up our lesson, our intro to JS lesson. It's going to be different on yours because we've rearranged the lessons a little bit. But now we have our file. Now we're going to start doing our assignments in here. So it's going to say, in these first 6 questions, replace null with the answer. So let's replace null with a string. We'll name it string. We save that, open up our terminal, and now we can say npm test js1.test. It's going to be the instructions in your repo are going to be a little bit different, and I'm going to post this in Slack. This is what we want you to write to test. It's not going to work on mine right now. Oh, it does. Yeah, okay, it works. Now it's going to give us a readout of our tests. And we can see if we go to the top, here's a list of our tests. And it looks like well, because it was in the wrong file. But you'll see that these will start to turn from red X's to green check marks. The goal of it is to get all green check marks, okay? So remember, you have to follow that link and download Node, and then you have to npm install from within the pre-course folder. You have to do it in the pre-course folder or it's not going to work. So that covers it for today. I want to leave the last 10 minutes to answer questions. And I see that there are a lot of questions. So let me open it up. Is there a reason you didn't use the else after the if statement? Absolutely, because we're going to talk about that on Monday. And you didn't need to use the else in that statement that I had given you. Will there ever going... we are not going over a review of the homework in this course. We do have the help channels, the lessons and the help channel specifically. And so just meet with, if you get the checks, if you get the green check marks on there, that's, you've answered the question correctly. And then you can review it with other students or with the TAs as well. Is JavaScript the same as Nodejs? Nodejs is a program that allows you to run JavaScript on a server. And so, no, they're not the same, but Node.js uses JavaScript. So JavaScript is kind of the programming language. And, you know, imagine Node.js is for use on a server. And what does that on the front end? Your web browser does that on the front end. And so your web browser allows you to use JavaScript on the front end, and Node.js allows you to use it on the server. So that's the difference between the two. We're not going to get super into Node in this mini boot camp. We do go fully into it in the full-time program, but just know that we're using it just to run our tests right now. Triple equal is so extreme, absolutely. We'll go over how JavaScript is used on the front end. At the end of this course, our last lesson is on DOM manipulation and putting all of our HTML and CSS and JavaScript together. That is part of this course. We're not going to be going in this course over how to use it on the back end. That's part of the full course. So I see a question about semicolons on here. Like I said, semicolons are not optional in this course, but JavaScript is a language, and to its detriment at some points, which tries to be very helpful for you. And so it tries to figure things out if you forget them. For the most part, it's going to remember where, it's going to figure out where you wanted to put your semicolon. And so if you forget it, it'll still run the way you want it to run. Unlike other languages, if you forget to put a semicolon, the entire thing will crash. But there are cases in JavaScript where if you forget to put a semicolon, it will crash your entire program. And until you know and recognize those cases, and they're very advanced cases, you need to put a semicolon. And that's just a really good habit to get into. And you just put them in there, and if you forget it and it still runs like it did here, then it still runs and you got lucky. Sometimes you're going to get lucky, and sometimes it's going to crash. We have the talk about string interpolation right here. We have a couple minutes left. I can go into it. So someone asked when that would be used in a string. That is used only in the case of backticks. So that allows us to, let's say name equals Dan. Const, Dan says hello. And if we use backticks, which are not single quotes, they are backticks, then we can use a $sign and an open closing brace and put a variable in there. And that is an ES6. It's called string interpolation, and it allows us to do, oops, it says hello. And it allows us to use the variables within our string. For now, you can use that if you know how. Otherwise, we can just say name plus, and the string says hello. It's essentially doing the exact same thing. It just allows us to put everything in one line right there. Cool. Well, that sums it up for today. There is an assignment tonight. Remember, you need to go into your GitHub repo, into the README. At the very end of the page, there will be a link to Node.js and the ability to download it. And it will, you'll download Node, and then either if you're on Windows, use your git bash terminal, or on Mac or Linux, use your bash terminal, which is just it's terminal. I use a different third-party terminal, but it's just called terminal. Go into you need a CD into your pre-course folder, and then you need to npm install, okay? And that's going to install all the dependencies and allow you to run your tests. To run your tests, and I'm going to post this in the general, you are going to write npm test js1.test, and that'll run your tests for you. Okay, that's about it for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining me, and thanks for hanging out this first week of Lambda School's mini bootcamp. We've got 2 more weeks to go. We're going to get much deeper into JavaScript next week and the week after, and then we're going to wrap it all up and use JavaScript on the front end and show you how to make an actual working web application. But thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll see you on Monday night. Bye.